I found out my great-uncle had died on a Tuesday afternoon when a lawyer named Gerald Martinez called me at work and asked if I could come to his office in Billings, Montana, as soon as possible. I had never even heard of this uncle, some distant relative on my father's side who apparently lived alone in the middle of nowhere and had no other living family except me. 3 days later, I was sitting in Martinez's cramped office while he slid a folder across his desk and told me I had just inherited 1,800 acres of pristine valley land in Park County. "Your uncle, Theodore Kingston, was quite the recluse," Martinez explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "He bought this property back in 1987 and lived there by himself for nearly 40 years. The land is worth a considerable amount, Mr. Kingston." I stared at the documents, my name printed next to words like sole heir and property deed. Xavier Kingston, that was me, a 32-year-old accountant from Seattle who had never owned anything more valuable than a used Honda Civic. Now I apparently owned a valley. "How much land did you say?" I asked. 1,800 acres. It includes a main house, several outbuildings, and some of the most beautiful terrain in Montana. There's a river running through it, forest, meadows. Your uncle was very protective of it, never let anyone build on it, never sold a single acre. I flew back to Seattle in a daze, but within 2 weeks, I had requested time off work and driven the 800 miles to see my inheritance. The property was everything Martinez had described and more. The valley stretched out like something from a painting, with the Absaroka Mountains rising in the distance and wildflowers covering the meadows in riots of purple and yellow. The house was old but solid, a 2-story log structure that my uncle had maintained meticulously. I spent a week there, walking the property, trying to understand what I was supposed to do with all this land. I had no intention of moving to Montana permanently. My life was in Seattle. But selling felt wrong somehow, like I would be betraying a man I had never met, but who had left me something precious. That was when I first encountered the Meadowbrook Valley Homeowners Association. I was checking the mailbox at the end of the long driveway when a silver SUV pulled up, and a woman in her mid-50s stepped out. She had that particular haircut that suburban moms get when they want to speak to managers, blonde with sharp angles, and she wore a purple cardigan despite the warm May weather. "Hello there," she said, her voice friendly but with an edge I could not quite place. "I'm Brenda Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Valley HOA. You must be Theodore's nephew." "Xavier Kingston," I said, shaking her hand. "I just inherited the property." "Yes, we heard about poor Theodore's passing. Such a shame. He was quite the character." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "I wanted to introduce myself and let you know about our community here. There are 43 beautiful homes in Meadowbrook Valley, and we maintain very high standards." I looked around, confused. "I haven't seen any homes. Where is this development?" "Oh, they're tucked back in the trees, very private. The development is on the eastern portion of the valley. Didn't Theodore tell you about it? I never actually met my uncle, and I've walked most of this property. I haven't seen any development." Brenda's smile tightened. "Well, perhaps you haven't explored the full extent of the land. The Meadowbrook Valley subdivision is definitely on this property. We've been here for 8 years now. Lovely community, very exclusive. Our HOA fees are $200 a month, by the way. You'll need to pay the back fees that Theodore refused to pay. That comes to about $19,000. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. "Wait, what? HOA fees? This is private property, my property." "Mr. Kingston, I understand you're new to this, but Meadowbrook Valley is a legally established subdivision. The residents bought their lots fair and square. Your uncle was quite difficult about the whole thing, refused to acknowledge the HOA's authority, but that doesn't change the legal reality. I'll have our attorney send you the paperwork." She got back in her SUV and drove off before I could respond, leaving me standing there with a growing sense of dread. I spent the next 2 days searching every inch of the eastern section of my property, and sure enough, I found them. Tucked into a wooded area about a mile from the main house were 43 homes, ranging from modest cabins to sprawling mini-mansions. They had paved roads, landscaping, even a small community center. It looked like it had been carved right out of my land. I called Martinez immediately. "There are houses on my property," I said without preamble. "Dozens of them. Did you know about this?" There was a long pause. "Your uncle mentioned something about a dispute, but he was quite vague about the details. He said he was handling it. Gerald, there's an entire subdivision on my land. They're claiming I owe them HOA fees." "That's absurd. You can't owe HOA fees on your own property. Let me make some calls and get back to you." 2 days later, Martinez called me back and his voice was grim. "Xavier, we have a serious problem. I've been going through Theodore's papers, and it appears that about 9 years ago, a development company called Summit Ridge Enterprises somehow obtained what they claimed were development rights to a portion of your uncle's property. They subdivided it and sold off lots to individual buyers. Your uncle fought it, but he was doing it alone without proper legal representation. He filed complaints, but nothing ever came of it. How is that even possible? How can someone sell land they don't own? That's what we need to find out. I'm going to need you to authorize me to do a full title search and start legal proceedings. This is going to be complicated and expensive, Xavier. These homeowners think they bought their land legitimately. They have deeds. They've been paying property taxes on their lots. But if those sales were fraudulent, this becomes a massive legal issue. I authorized him to do whatever was necessary. I was not about to let someone steal my land, even if it meant a fight. The next week, Brenda Patterson showed up at my door with 2 other people, a tall man in an expensive suit and another woman with silver hair and a stern expression. "Mr. Kingston, we need to talk," Brenda said. "This is Richard Chen, our HOA attorney, and Margaret Foster, our vice president." I let them in, more out of curiosity than hospitality. Richard Chen pulled out a briefcase and extracted a thick folder. "Mr. Kingston, I represent the Meadowbrook Valley Homeowners Association. My clients are concerned about your intentions regarding the subdivision. I want to make it clear that our residents have legal deeds to their properties. Any attempt to dispute their ownership will be met with vigorous legal resistance." "Legal deeds based on what?" I asked. "No one had the right to sell that land. My uncle owned it, and now I own it." "Summit Ridge Enterprises had development rights," Chen said smoothly. "They secured those rights through proper legal channels in 2016. Your uncle was notified at the time. I'd like to see the documentation for those rights." Chen's expression flickered, just for a moment. "That's confidential business information." "Not if it involves my property, it isn't." Brenda leaned forward. "Mr. Kingston, let's be reasonable here. 43 families have made their homes in Meadowbrook Valley. They've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them have children in the local schools. You can't just come in and disrupt all of that over some technicality." "A technicality? Someone sold my property without my family's permission. That's called fraud, not a technicality." Margaret Foster spoke for the first time, her voice cold. "Your uncle was a difficult, unreasonable man who refused to accept progress. We hoped you would be more practical. The HOA is prepared to offer you a settlement, $25,000 to drop any claims and officially recognize the subdivision." I actually laughed. $25,000. For land worth millions. You're not serious. Then we'll see you in court, Chen said, standing up. But I should warn you, litigation like this can take years and cost you everything you have. These homeowners will fight to protect their investments. After they left, I sat in my uncle's living room, feeling overwhelmed. I understood why Theodore had become a recluse. Dealing with these people was exhausting. Martinez filed a lawsuit within the week. We sued Summit Ridge Enterprises, the HOA, and asked the court to void all the property sales. The response was immediate and explosive. Every homeowner in Meadowbrook Valley received notice that their property ownership was being challenged, and my phone started ringing constantly with angry calls. Someone spray-painted "land thief" on my uncle's mailbox. I received threatening letters. But I also started receiving other kinds of calls. A woman named Sandra Morris called me crying, saying she had put her entire life savings into her Meadowbrook Valley home and couldn't afford to lose it. A retired couple, the Hendersons, told me they had sold their house in California and bought in the subdivision, believing they were getting a legitimate property. These were not bad people. They were victims too. The case moved slowly through the Montana court system. Martinez brought in a specialist attorney named Yolanda Turner, who had experience with property fraud cases. She was sharp, thorough, and expensive, but she started uncovering things that made my blood boil. Summit Ridge Enterprises, it turned out, had never actually obtained any legal development rights. They had fabricated documents, forged signatures, and somehow managed to get the fraudulent deeds recorded with the county. The company's principal was a man named Douglas Vance, who had a history of shady real estate deals across 3 states. "This is bigger than we thought," Yolanda told me during a conference call 6 months into the litigation. Vance didn't work alone. Someone at the county recorder's office had to be involved to get these fraudulent deeds recorded. We're talking about a criminal conspiracy here. Should we go to the police? We already have. The Park County Sheriff's Department has opened an investigation, but the civil case is separate. We need to prove in court that these sales were invalid. The HOA fought us every step of the way. They filed motion after motion, trying to get the case dismissed. Richard Chen argued that even if the original development rights were questionable, the homeowners had bought their properties in good faith and should be protected. He cited something called the bona fide purchaser doctrine, which basically said that innocent buyers who didn't know about fraud could keep their property. But Yolanda was ready for that argument. She showed that many of the homeowners should have known something was wrong. The prices they paid were suspiciously low for what they were getting. Several had been personally contacted by Theodore, warning them that the sales were fraudulent. Some had even received certified letters from my uncle's attorney, which they had ignored. The case went to trial in March, almost a year after I had inherited the property. The courtroom in Livingston, Montana, was packed. All 43 homeowners showed up, along with their families. I sat at the plaintiff's table, feeling like the villain in a movie, even though I knew I was the victim here. Judge Patricia Morrison presided. She was a stern woman in her 60s who had a reputation for being fair but tough. She listened to 5 days of testimony, reviewed hundreds of documents, and asked pointed questions that made both sides squirm. Douglas Vance was subpoenaed to testify, but he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights on every question, which did not look good for the HOA's case. A clerk from the county recorder's office named Timothy Walsh was called to the stand, and he fell apart under questioning. He admitted that Vance had paid him $10,000 to expedite the recording of the deeds without proper verification. Brenda Patterson testified that the HOA had no knowledge of any fraud. She insisted that Summit Ridge Enterprises had presented all the proper documentation, and the HOA had relied on that in good faith. Mrs. Patterson, Yolanda asked during cross-examination, did you ever personally verify that Summit Ridge Enterprises had the right to sell this land? That's not the HOA's responsibility, Brenda said defensively. We trusted the development company. But Mr. Theodore Kingston contacted you personally, didn't he? He sent you a letter in August 2017 informing you that the land sales were fraudulent. He was just an angry old man who didn't want neighbors. Did you investigate his claims? No, because our attorney assured us everything was legal. Did your attorney actually verify the title? Brenda hesitated. I assume so. You assume, Mrs. Patterson. Did you know that Richard Chen received a $20,000 payment from Summit Ridge Enterprises shortly after the subdivision was established? The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison banged her gavel, calling for order. Richard Chen was on his feet, objecting loudly. But the damage was done. It turned out that Yolanda had discovered financial records showing that Chen had been paid by Vance's company, a clear conflict of interest that he had never disclosed to his HOA clients. The trial continued for another 2 days, but the outcome was becoming clear. Judge Morrison took a week to issue her ruling, and when she did, it was comprehensive and devastating to the HOA's case. She found that Summit Ridge Enterprises had engaged in fraud, that the property sales were invalid, and that the deeds should be voided. However, she also recognized that the homeowners had invested substantial money and built their lives in Meadowbrook Valley. Her solution was complex but fair. First, she ordered that the property officially belong to me, Xavier Kingston, as the rightful heir. The HOA had no authority over my land and never had. All claims of HOA fees were dismissed with prejudice. Second, she found that Summit Ridge Enterprises was liable for fraud and ordered Douglas Vance to pay full restitution to every homeowner. Since Vance's company was essentially bankrupt, she ordered the seizure of all his assets, including 3 properties he owned in Montana and Idaho. Third, and most controversially, she found that the HOA leadership, specifically Brenda Patterson, Richard Chen, and Margaret Foster, had acted with willful blindness to the fraud, and had continued to assert authority over my property despite being informed of the illegality. She ordered them to personally compensate me for the legal fees I had incurred, which totaled over $200,000. Fourth, she gave the homeowners 2 options. They could work out individual agreements with me to purchase their lots at fair market value, or they could pursue claims against Summit Ridge Enterprises and its principals for the return of their money. She gave everyone 6 months to decide. Finally, she referred the matter to the Montana Attorney General's office for criminal prosecution of everyone involved in the fraud. The courtroom was chaos after the ruling. Some homeowners were crying. Others were angry. Brenda Patterson stood up and shouted, "This is an outrage. We'll appeal." Judge Morrison fixed her with a cold stare. "Mrs. Patterson, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort her out." I watched as Brenda was led out of the courtroom, still protesting. I did not feel victorious. I felt exhausted and sorry for the families who had been caught up in this mess through no fault of their own. Over the next few months, 38 of the 43 homeowners approached me about buying their lots. I worked with a real estate appraiser to determine fair market value and sold them the land at reasonable prices. Some I even gave a discount to, particularly the ones like Sandra Morris, who had been genuinely victimized and had no resources to fight back. The other 5 homeowners decided to take their chances pursuing Summit Ridge Enterprises for refunds. I did not force them to leave immediately, but I made it clear that they were now on my property and would need to make arrangements eventually. The criminal investigation moved forward. Douglas Vance was arrested in Nevada and extradited to Montana. He eventually pleaded guilty to fraud and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Timothy Walsh, the county clerk who had taken bribes, received 3 years and lost his job. Richard Chen was disbarred by the Montana Bar Association for his undisclosed conflict of interest and his role in perpetuating the fraud. He tried to fight it, but eventually gave up and moved to Florida. Brenda Patterson, Margaret Foster, and 2 other HOA board members were charged with fraud and conspiracy. Their trial was shorter than mine had been, and the outcome was decisive. Brenda received 18 months in prison, though she served only 10 months before being released for good behavior. Margaret Foster received probation and community service. All of them were ordered to pay restitution to me for the legal fees, as Judge Morrison had directed. The Meadowbrook Valley Homeowners Association was officially dissolved by court order. The community center and common areas reverted to my ownership. I spent a lot of time in Montana over those months, getting to know the people who were now my neighbors. Many of them were good people who had just wanted a nice place to live. We organized potlucks, and I helped several families who were struggling financially. I sold them their lots at cost, sometimes even less, just to make sure they could stay. Sandra Morris became a friend. She was a single mother of 2 who worked as a nurse in Livingston. She had bought her small cabin with money inherited from her mother and had been terrified of losing it. I sold her the lot for $10,000, a fraction of its value, and she cried when I handed her the deed. "Why are you being so nice to us?" she asked. "We were part of the group that made your life hell." "You didn't know," I said. "You were victims too. Brenda and the others used you as shields. I'm not going to punish you for their crimes." The Henderson couple, the retirees from California, bought their lot at full market value but thanked me profusely for being reasonable. "We were ready to lose everything," Mr. Henderson said. "You could have forced us out. You didn't have to work with us." "My uncle was apparently a difficult man," I said, "but I don't think he would have wanted innocent people to suffer. He fought the fraud, not the families." By the end of the 6-month period Judge Morrison had set, I had resolved things with all but 2 of the homeowners. Those 2 were a couple named the Prestons who insisted they had done nothing wrong and refused to negotiate. I eventually had to file eviction proceedings and they finally left, threatening to sue. They never did. I kept the main house and about 500 acres around it, including the most beautiful parts of the valley. The rest I sold off in the legitimate sales to the former Meadowbrook Valley residents. I made sure every deed was properly recorded, every title was clear, and everything was done by the book. With the money from the land sales and the restitution payments I received, I paid off all my legal fees and had enough left over to quit my job in Seattle. I decided to make Montana my permanent home. The valley was too beautiful to leave, and I had grown attached to the community that had formed there, despite the rocky start. I renovated my uncle's house, turning it into a comfortable year-round residence. I learned to love the harsh Montana winters and the spectacular summers. I started a small consulting business that I could run remotely, which gave me the income I needed without tying me to an office. Sandra Morris and I started dating about a year after everything settled down. Her kids loved the property, and I loved having them around. We took things slow, but it felt right in a way nothing in Seattle ever had. The land that had been designated for the community center, which reverted to me after the HOA dissolved, I turned into an actual community space. Not one run by an HOA with ridiculous rules and fees, but an open area where neighbors could gather. I built a pavilion and some picnic tables. We hosted barbecues and holiday parties. It became the heart of what was now just a neighborhood, not a subdivision. 3 years after inheriting the valley, I stood on the porch of my uncle's house, watching the sun set over the mountains and turning the sky orange and pink. Sandra was inside making dinner. Her kids were down by the river fishing. The valley was alive with the sounds of summer, birds calling, the rush of water, the distant laughter of children. I thought about Theodore, the great uncle I had never met. He had spent 40 years protecting this place, fighting off developers and outsiders who wanted to exploit it. In the end, they had managed to steal a piece of it, but not for long. I had finished what he started, reclaimed what was ours, and turned something ugly into something good. My phone rang. It was Martinez, who had become a friend over the years of working together. "Xavier, I just heard from the prosecutor's office. Brenda Patterson is out of prison. She's apparently moved to Wyoming." "Good," I said. "I hope she learned her lesson." "There's one more thing. They recovered some additional assets from Summit Ridge Enterprises, another property that Vance owned. The court is liquidating it to pay the remaining restitution owed to the homeowners who tried to pursue him directly. It looks like they'll actually get most of their money back. That's great news. You did a good thing, Xavier. You could have made this much harder on everyone. Instead, you found a way to make it right." After we hung up, I went inside. Sandra was at the stove, and the smell of her cooking filled the house. The kids came running in, excited about the fish they had caught, even though they had thrown them all back. We sat down to dinner together, and I realized that inheriting this valley had not just given me land. It had given me a purpose, a home, and a family. It had tested me in ways I never expected, forcing me to fight for what was right while trying to be fair to people who had been deceived. The HOA that tried to steal my property was gone, its leaders punished, its fraudulent authority dissolved. The people who had been used as pawns in someone else's scheme were now legitimate landowners with clean titles, and no one demanding fees or telling them what color they could paint their shutters. And I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Years later, when people asked me about the whole ordeal, I kept it simple. Someone tried to steal my land by creating a fake homeowners association and selling lots they did not own. The court made them compensate the buyers and punished the criminals involved. Justice was served, and good people were protected. But the full story was more complicated and more human than that. It was about greed and deception, yes, but also about community and fairness. It was about learning that fighting for what is right does not mean hurting innocent people in the process. The valley that Theodore Kingston protected for 40 years was safe now, at least the parts I had kept. The rest belonged to people who actually owned it legally and who treated it with respect. There was no HOA to send threatening letters about lawn height or deck color. There were just neighbors who looked out for each other and shared a beautiful piece of Montana. Sandra and I got married the following spring, in the meadow where some of the worst of the fraudulent lots had been. The homeowners who had stayed threw us a reception, insisting on handling everything themselves. It was their way of thanking me for giving them a second chance. As we danced under string lights hung between the trees, with the mountains watching over us and the river providing a soundtrack, I felt the weight of the last few years finally lift. The fight was over. The valley was at peace. And I had found something I did not even know I was looking for when I first got that call from Martinez. I had found home. The legal battle had been exhausting and expensive, but in the end, the system worked. The fraudsters were punished. The criminals went to jail. The innocent buyers were protected, and the land that should never have been stolen was returned to its rightful owner. Sometimes I walked through the neighborhood that used to be Meadowbrook Valley, chatting with the people who lived there. They were not HOA members anymore. They were not subject to arbitrary rules or excessive fees. They were just people living their lives on land they legitimately owned. The community center I had built became popular beyond just our immediate neighborhood. People from Livingston would drive out for events. We hosted a 4th of July celebration that drew over 200 people. We had a Christmas market where local artisans sold their crafts. The valley became known not as a place of conflict, but as a place of community. I never did find out exactly what Theodore had been like as a person. The few people who remembered him described him as stubborn, private, and fiercely protective of his land. I understood why. When someone tries to take something from you through deception and fraud, when they use the system against you and hide behind innocent victims, it hardens you. But I also knew that Theodore must have had a softer side. He could have sold this land 100 times over the years. Developers had surely approached him with offers. He could have made millions and lived anywhere he wanted. Instead, he stayed here alone, protecting a valley that most people never saw. He left it to me, a nephew he had never met, trusting that I would do something good with it. I hoped I had lived up to that trust. The 5 remaining acres of common space that had been part of the fraudulent subdivision became a nature preserve. I put up signs identifying the local plants and wildlife. Local schools brought students for field trips. Sandra, who had a background in biology from before she became a nurse, helped create educational materials. The river that ran through the property became a popular spot for fishing and kayaking. I made sure to keep the access open to the public, not just to the people who lived in the former subdivision. Theodore had kept the valley locked away for 40 years. I wanted to share it, within reason. Every year on the anniversary of Judge Morrison's ruling, we held a community dinner. It started as a small thing, just me and a few of the homeowners who had been most affected by the fraud. But it grew over time. People brought their families, new neighbors joined, and it became a tradition. At the 5th anniversary dinner, Sandra stood up to give a toast. 5 years ago, most of us were terrified. We thought we were going to lose our homes, our investments, everything. Xavier could have made that happen. He had every legal right to kick us all out and do whatever he wanted with this land. But he didn't. He chose compassion over revenge. He chose community over profit. And that's why we're all here today, not just as neighbors, but as friends. To Xavier. Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I had not done anything special, not really. I had just tried to do what was right. But maybe that was the point. When Brenda Patterson and her cronies had tried to steal my land, they had not thought about what was right. They had thought about power and control and money. They had hidden behind legal jargon and intimidation tactics. They had tried to make me the villain for defending my own property. The courts had seen through it. Judge Morrison, in particular, had understood exactly what was happening and crafted a solution that punished the guilty while protecting the innocent. The criminal justice system had followed through, putting the real criminals behind bars, and in the end, everyone came out better than they had started, except for the fraudsters who deserved their fate. I still lived in my uncle's house, though it looked very different now. Sandra and I had expanded it, adding a room for each of her kids and modernizing the kitchen. We kept the original log structure and the stone fireplace that Theodore had built himself, according to the story Martinez had told me. The view from the porch never got old. Every morning I had my coffee there, watching the mist rise off the river and the sun illuminate the peaks. Every evening I sat there as the alpenglow turned the mountains pink and gold. This was my valley now, or at least part of it. The rest belonged to the good people who had been caught up in someone else's scheme. Together, we had turned a story of fraud and theft into a story of justice and community. I thought about what my life might have been like if I had never gotten that call from Martinez. I would still be in Seattle, working at a job I found moderately interesting but not fulfilling, living in an apartment, disconnected from nature and community. I would never have known Theodore existed. I would never have seen this valley. Instead, I had been given a gift, even though it came wrapped in conflict and legal battles. I had been tested and forced to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. I could have sold everything to the highest bidder and walked away rich. I could have evicted everyone and turned the valley into a private retreat. I could have done a lot of things, but I had chosen to fight for what was right and fair. And in doing so, I had gained more than money or land. I had gained a home, a family, and a community. The legacy of the Meadowbrook Valley HOA was not one of community standards and property values. It was one of fraud, deception, and greed. Brenda Patterson and her associates had tried to build something on stolen land, using the veneer of legitimacy to hide their crimes. They had failed. The real legacy belonged to the people who stayed, who worked with me to make things right, who built genuine relationships instead of enforcing arbitrary rules. That was the community Theodore had inadvertently protected by refusing to let the fraudsters win during his lifetime. I often wondered what he would think of the valley now. Would he be angry that I had sold off portions of it? Would he understand why I had chosen to let the innocent homeowners stay? Would he approve of the community center and the nature preserve and the public access to the river? I like to think he would. A man who spent 40 years protecting this place must have loved it deeply. And people who love something truly do not just want to possess it. They want to share it, to let others experience its beauty, to ensure it continues to thrive. That was what I tried to do. Every decision I made about the valley, I asked myself if it was good for the land and good for the people. Sometimes those interests conflicted, but usually they aligned. The fraudulent HOA had claimed to serve the community while actually serving only the egos and bank accounts of its leaders. A real community does not need mandatory membership or monthly fees or threatening letters about paint colors. It needs people who care about each other and the place they share. We had that now. It had been born from conflict, but it was real and strong. Kids played together. Neighbors helped each other with projects. We shared tools and recipes and stories. When someone was struggling, others stepped up. That was worth more than any amount of money the land might bring if I sold it to developers. That was worth all the legal fees and stress and angry confrontations. That was the real inheritance Theodore had left me, though he probably did not know it when he put my name on his will. As I sat on that porch, watching another Montana sunset paint the sky, I knew I had made the right choices. The valley was protected. The people were safe. Justice had been served. And somewhere, I hoped, Theodore Kingston was at peace, knowing his land was in good hands. The story of the Meadowbrook Valley HOA became something of a legend in Park County. Local lawyers used it as an example in seminars about property fraud. Real estate agents told buyers to always verify titles and be wary of deals that seemed too good to be true. The county recorder's office implemented new verification procedures to prevent anything like it from happening again. For me, it was just life. The dramatic part was over. Now came the part where I actually lived here, built a life with Sandra, watched her kids grow up, maintained the property, and continued to be part of the community. Sometimes people from other parts of Montana, or even from other states, would contact me. They had heard about my case and were dealing with similar situations, property disputes or fraudulent sales or HOA overreach. I tried to help when I could, offering advice and connecting them with Yolanda Turner, who had become something of a specialist in these cases. The fight against the Meadowbrook Valley HOA had changed me. I had learned that I was stronger than I thought, that I could stand up to intimidation and pressure, that I could fight for what was right even when it was hard and expensive and unpopular. But I had also learned about mercy and fairness. I had learned that fighting for justice does not mean crushing everyone in your path. It means distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent, between the perpetrators and the victims. Brenda Patterson, Richard Chen, Douglas Vance, and their associates deserved what they got. They had committed fraud, stolen land, and used innocent people as shields. They had shown no remorse until they were caught, and even then they had fought to avoid accountability. But Sandra Morris, the Hendersons, and the dozens of other families who bought homes in Meadowbrook Valley did not deserve to lose everything. They had been deceived. They had trusted the wrong people. They deserved a second chance, and I was glad I could give it to them. That distinction between the guilty and the innocent, between vengeance and justice, was what made the difference. It was what turned a story of theft into a story of redemption. It was what transformed a fraudulent subdivision into a genuine community. Years from now, when I was old and maybe had kids of my own, I would tell them about the valley and how we fought to protect it. I would tell them about their great-great-uncle Theodore, who spent his life guarding this place from those who would exploit it. I would tell them about the people who tried to steal it and the judge who made them pay. But mostly, I would tell them about the importance of doing what is right, even when it is hard. About standing up to bullies and fraudsters, but also about showing mercy to those who do not deserve punishment. About building real communities based on respect and care, not rules and fees. That was the real lesson of the Meadowbrook Valley HOA saga. Not that I won some legal battle, though I did. Not that criminals were punished, though they were. The real lesson was that justice and compassion can coexist, that you can fight for what is yours while still treating others fairly, that the best revenge is building something good from something bad. The valley taught me that. The people who became my neighbors taught me that. Sandra and her kids taught me that. Even Brenda Patterson taught me that in her own twisted way, by showing me exactly the kind of person I did not want to be. And so the valley lived on, no longer under threat, no longer the subject of legal battles and criminal investigations. Just a beautiful piece of Montana where people lived their lives, raised their families, and appreciated the natural world around them. Xavier Kingston's Valley. My valley. Our valley. And it would stay that way, protected and cherished for generations to come.